Snow fell in fat, unhurried flakes over the boardwalk outside Iron Creek's Grange Hall, and Caleb Whitmore's boots hit the porch steps before the preacher's wife had finished her sentence. Behind him, wrapped in his own coat, stood the Korean woman the whole town had refused a seat among them. "She buries her dead decent," he said, low enough that only the front row heard the warning under it. "Same as any of you." No one answered him, no one dared. Her hand trembled over a wooden cross, scratched with a stranger's name, the week she landed in Wyoming territory. Salt-white train dust still in her hair. Months later, that same hand wore a plain iron ring she had not expected to want. And still some mornings, she woke afraid it would be taken from her too. Between those two mornings lay a winter neither of them spoke about outright. A debt, a fire, and a name neither would say first. She had sailed half a world on nothing but a photograph and a signature, and found only a wooden marker waiting instead of a husband. Iron Creek's women turned their backs before she'd set down her bundle. Its men did not bother turning at all. She told herself she had survived worse than cold shoulders. She had not yet met winter on that ridge, or the man digging beside the grave who would not let her survive it alone. Before the town watched Caleb Whitmore choose her in front of every soul that had scorned her, before the fire, before the vows spoken over a kitchen table instead of an altar, there was only a rutted wagon road, a late October wind, and a widow who did not yet know she was one. This is where it began, not with a wedding, but with a grave that already had her husband's name carved into it, and no one left standing beside it who was supposed to be there. The train from Cheyenne pulled into Iron Creek Station in a wash of coal smoke and October wind, and Yun-hee-an stepped down onto a platform of unfamiliar faces with a cloth bundle pressed against her chest, like the only solid thing left in the world. She had crossed the Pacific on a steamer crowded with other picture brides, then a continent by rail, carrying a photograph so creased from handling that the man's face had gone soft at the edges. A stranger named Byung-ho who had signed papers making her his wife before either of them had ever spoken a word to the other. No one on the platform called her name. A station master glanced at her trunk, glanced at her face, and looked away as though she were a parcel misdelivered to the wrong county. She had expected strangeness. She had not expected the particular chill of being looked at and immediately unseen. A whole town's worth of eyes sliding past her like she cast no shadow at all. A hired wagon driver, an older man with tobacco-stained teeth, agreed to take her out toward the homestead claim only after she doubled his fee, muttering something about foreigners and bad luck that she understood by tone if not by word. The road west of town narrowed to ruts through dry grass gone the color of old rope, fences leaning, the sky lowering itself gray and vast over land that seemed to stretch on with no intention of ever ending. She had memorized 3 sentences of English on the boat: "My name is," "Thank you," "Where is," and found none of them useful for the silence the driver kept. Somewhere past the second creek crossing, wood smoke rose thin from a chimney that was not the one on her husband's claim, and a dog barked once, twice, then stopped as if warned. Yun-hee held the photograph in her lap the last hour of the ride, studying the soft, unfamiliar mouth in it, trying to build a voice for a man she had never heard speak, a laugh she had never heard laugh, and failing every time, the way she had failed every night on the ship when she tried to imagine her own future and found only a gray, unfinished sketch of a house and a husband standing in a doorway with no clear face. The driver finally reined the horses to a stop where the ruts gave out into open field, pointed with his chin toward a rise of raw earth at the edge of a fenced parcel, and said a word she did not know, but understood anyway from the shape of his mouth and the way his eyes would not meet hers. Grave, she climbed down from the wagon on legs gone stiff with cold and fear both, and walked the last 100 yards alone across grass silvered with early frost, toward a mound of turned soil too fresh to have grown anything yet, and a plain wooden cross driven into the earth at its head. She did not need to read the English letters scratched into the crossbar to understand what she was looking at. She reached it anyway, and knelt, and read them regardless, tracing the carved name with one bare finger, as though touch alone could make the two of them, at last, finally, formally introduced. She was still kneeling there when a second shadow fell across the cross, long in the low afternoon light, and she looked up to find a man watching her with an expression she could not immediately name. Not pity exactly, and not the cold distaste she had worn like a second coat since stepping off the train, but something closer to recognition, as if he had knelt at that particular kind of grief before, and knew better than to interrupt it carelessly. He was tall in the way of men who worked outdoors for a living, weathered past his years, a rifle broken open over one forearm from checking a fence line, and he did not ask who she was before he spoke, only crouched a respectful distance off and said, slow and plain, that he was sorry, that he was the one who'd found Byung-ho 3 weeks back when the smoke stopped rising from the chimney, that he was the one who dug the grave himself because the undertaker in town wouldn't touch a foreigner's body, and the ground was already half frozen and somebody had to. He said his name was Caleb Whitmore, that his own claim bordered this one to the north, and that he'd have written to whatever family there was to write to, except there'd been no address anywhere in the cabin, nothing but a folded photograph of a young woman's face tucked inside a Bible on the shelf. Yeon-hee understood perhaps 1 word in 4 of what followed, but she understood the photograph he was describing, because it was the mirror of the one she carried, and something in her chest went very still and very cold at the thought of Byung-ho keeping her likeness close in his last weeks, a stranger's face he had chosen to trust before ever meeting her. Caleb offered, haltingly, gesturing more than speaking once he saw her English falter, that she was welcome to stay the night at his place rather than the empty cabin behind them, that his housekeeper could make up a bed, that the weather was turning, and a homestead with no fire laid and no wood cut was no place for anyone to sleep alone their first night in the territory. As he spoke, Yeon-hee caught a flicker of movement at the tree line behind him. A small girl, 7 or 8, dark-haired, watching the two of them from behind a fence post with the unblinking patience of a child who has learned to be quiet around grief. Caleb did not turn to look. He seemed to know exactly where the girl stood without needing to check, the way a person knows the position of a hand permanently stationed near an old wound. Yeon-hee looked back down at the fresh grave, at the name that made her a widow before she had ever been a wife, and found she had no strength left to refuse the offer, only enough to nod once and wonder, as she rose and followed a stranger's shadow toward an unfamiliar house, why a man who owed her nothing had already dug 2 things that day, a grave, and, though she would not understand it for months yet, a door back open in himself he'd sworn shut a long time before. The Whitmore house sat low and sturdy against the coming dark, a timber and sod homestead built to survive weather rather than impress a visitor, smoke already curling from its chimney by the time they reached the yard, though Yeon-hee would learn later that Caleb kept the fire laid and burning from first light to last, regardless of who was or wasn't home to warm by it, a habit from a winter he never spoke about directly. An older woman named Ruth, hired to keep house and mind the girl since Caleb had neither wife nor patience for either task alone, opened the door with a lamp raised and took one long look at Yeon-hee's face before she said, not unkindly, that the spare room hadn't been slept in for 2 years and would need airing, and went to see to it without waiting for permission from anyone. The girl from the fence post turned out to be Etta, Caleb's niece, 8 years old and solemn in a way that children only become after losing something no one had properly explained to them, and she watched Yeon-hee across the supper table that first night with the frank, unembarrassed curiosity children keep long after adults have trained themselves out of it, finally asking Caleb in a whisper loud enough to carry whether the lady was going to stay, and Caleb answering just as plainly that he didn't rightly know yet, that it wasn't only up to him. It was Ruth, over the washing up, who explained in slow, careful English what the county clerk would tell Yeon-hee outright the following week, that Byung-ho's claim carried debt against it from the freight company that had shipped his tools and seed, that as his legal widow she had inherited both the land and the obligation attached to it, and that most women in her position, foreign or otherwise, sold out cheap to the first buyer and left before the first snow made the roads impassable. Caleb, overhearing this from the doorway with a coffee cup halfway to his mouth, said only that nobody was selling anything to anybody until spring, that the roof over his own head wasn't legally hers to claim, but he was offering it anyway for as long as the offer was needed, debt or no debt, town opinion or no town opinion. Yeon-hee, understanding perhaps half the conversation in the moment and the rest of it only in memory later that night, lay awake in the aired-out spare room listening to windwork at the shutters, and tried to reconcile the 2 versions of this territory she had been handed within a single day. Place that would let a man die alone in a locked-up cabin without anyone checking the chimney smoke for 3 full weeks, and a place that would also produce, out of that same silence, a stranger willing to dig a grave with his own hands and open his home to a widow he'd known less than an afternoon. She did not yet have a word in either language for what she felt toward Caleb Whitmore. She only knew that for the first time since stepping off the train, she had stopped bracing for the next unkindness, and that the knot bracing frightened her nearly as much as the unkindness itself had. Word that the foreign widow was lodging under Caleb Whitmore's roof reached Iron Creek before Yeonhee herself ever set foot in it again. Carried the fast, efficient way small-town gossip always traveled, faster than mail, faster than weather. Ruth brought the shape of it back from the mercantile 2 days later. That Mrs. Louisa Thorne, the Reverend's wife, had called it a scandal before she'd even confirmed the details. That Otis Dunlap at the store had wondered aloud whether Caleb meant to marry the girl for the land or simply meant to keep her the way a man keeps a stray dog fed through winter. And that nobody, not one soul in town, had thought to ask whether the widow herself had eaten a proper meal since her husband died, alone 3 weeks before anyone noticed. Caleb took the gossip the way Yeonhee was learning he took most things, with a long silence, a tightening at the jaw, and no outward reply at all, though that night at supper he set down his fork harder than the meal required, when Etta repeated without malice something a schoolyard friend had told her about the strange lady in her uncle's house. It was Etta, small and unguarded in the particular way of children who haven't yet learned which truths are meant to be kept, who told Yeonhee, half in English, half in patient gesture, over a shared task of shelling dried beans by lamplight, that Uncle Caleb had dug another grave once, a long time ago, her mama's, and that nobody talked about it because it made him go quiet for days after, and that maybe that was why he didn't seem to mind digging one for the man Yeonhee had come to marry, because he already knew how. Yeonhee set down the beans in her lap and looked toward the doorway where Caleb's silhouette passed on his way to check the horses, and understood, with the sudden clarity of a piece sliding into a puzzle before she could see the whole picture, that the grave at her homestead had cost him something older and deeper than a stranger's death, something he had not offered to explain, and that she, still fumbling for the English words even to ask a simple question, had no way yet to reach. She wondered, lying awake again that night with the wind quieter than before, what a man buried twice over in his own silence looked like from the inside, and whether he had chosen to dig her husband's grave because it was the decent thing to do, or because some part of him needed, every so often, to prove to himself that he could still stand over a fresh mound of earth without it breaking him a second time. Caleb insisted, against Ruth's quiet advice and Yeonhee's own reluctance, that she come into town for Sunday service the first week of November, arguing plainly that hiding her away at the homestead would only feed the gossip already circling, that a widow had every right to sit in a church pew same as anyone burying grief that season. Yeonhee, dressed with more care than she had for anything since the wedding photograph was taken, wound her braid tight, tucked a faded ribbon of pale silk, the one thing she'd carried from her mother's house in Korea that had no practical use whatsoever, into the collar of her borrowed dark dress, and told herself, in the language she still thought fastest in, that she had survived worse crossings than one church aisle. She had not, as it turned out, survived anything quite like the particular silence that fell over the pews when she and Caleb walked in together, nor the way Louisa Thorne turned in her seat at the front row with the unhurried deliberateness of a woman who had rehearsed her cruelty in advance, and announced, pitched to Carrie, that she hadn't realized the Whitmore claim had taken in strays, that surely the poor foreign creature would be more comfortable among her own kind, wherever that might be found in this territory. A ripple of laughter, brief and ugly, moved through the room before the Reverend could open his mouth to object, and Yeonhee felt the old chill return in full, the sensation of being looked through rather than looked at, made worse now by the fact that every eye in the building had turned to watch her feel it. She did not know the English words to answer with. She knew only how to stand very still, the way she had learned to stand still through every insult on the long journey west, as though stillness itself were armor. It was Caleb who broke the silence, and he did it without raising his voice above the ordinary pitch of a man remarking on weather, which made it land harder than shouting could have. He said that the widow beside him had buried her husband with more grace in 1 week than most of the room had managed for their own kin in a lifetime, that she'd crossed an ocean on the strength of a promise nobody else in this church had kept for her, and that any soul who couldn't share a pew with a grieving woman was welcome to explain that particular Christian arithmetic to the Reverend directly. He did not wait for a response. He simply walked Yeonhee to an open pew near the middle of the room and sat down beside her as though the matter were already settled, and it was, though Louisa Thorne's face went the color of a stove left too long on the coals, and though Yeonhee could feel, even without turning to check, that every whisper in the building had shifted from mockery to something colder and more calculating, a town recalculating exactly what kind of trouble Caleb Whitmore had brought home with him. The service ended and the congregation dispersed in the particular hurry of people eager to discuss what they'd just witnessed, once they were safely out of earshot of it. And Caleb steered Yeonhee toward the mercantile for the week's supplies rather than straight home. A small, defiant errand that told the whole street plainly he did not intend to hide her going forward. Otis Dunlap weighed out flour and coffee with visibly reluctant hands, and made a show of counting Caleb's coin twice before he finally spoke, low enough to seem private, though pitched exactly loud enough for Yeonhee to catch the shape of it, that a man named Silas Draper had been asking around lately about the old On claim, whether the widow meant to sell, whether the water rights that ran along the creek boundary were still attached proper to the deed, and that Draper wasn't a man accustomed to waiting long for an answer once he'd set his mind on a piece of ground. Caleb's expression didn't change in any way a stranger could have read, but Yeonhee, who had spent 3 weeks now learning the small grammar of his face the way she'd once learned English vocabulary, one careful observation at a time, saw something tighten behind his eyes at the mention of the name Draper, an old wariness surfacing the way a fish shadow moves under still water. He paid for the goods without further comment, loaded the wagon, and said nothing at all until they were well clear of town, the horses settling into an easy trot along the frozen ruts. At which point, he finally spoke, not in answer to any question Yeonhee had asked, but as though continuing a private argument with himself. He said that Silas Draper had wanted the On Creek frontage long before Byung-ho ever filed his claim on it, that Draper had wanted a good many things over the years that other men happened to be standing on, and that a man who dug 2 graves for strangers no one else would bury had learned, the hard way, exactly how far certain neighbors were willing to go to get what they had already decided belonged to them. Yeonhee asked, in the careful broken English she was assembling, sentence by sentence, whether he meant that her husband's death had not been only weather and bad luck, and Caleb was quiet long enough that the question seemed to hang unanswered over the whole ride home, until at last he said only that he didn't know for certain, that he'd wondered the same thing more than once standing over that grave with a shovel in his hands, and that wondering without proof was its own particular kind of grief, one he'd apparently sentenced himself to carry twice now in the same short season. Winter closed over Iron Creek in earnest through December, the kind of cold that turned breath to visible cloud and made every outdoor chore a negotiation with numb fingers, and by unspoken agreement rather than any conversation either of them could later point to. Yeonhee began spending her days at Caleb's side rather than idle in the spare room, waiting for a decision about her husband's claim to make itself. She learned to feed stock in temperatures that made her homeland's harshest winter feel mild by comparison, learned the particular silence of a barn at first light, broken only by the soft huff of horses and the rhythmic scrape of a shovel, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that Caleb was patient in a way the rest of Iron Creek had not prepared her to expect from a man his neighbors called cold behind his back. He taught her English the way he seemed to do most things, without fuss or ceremony, naming tools as he handed them to her, correcting her pronunciation of hammer or trough or fence line with the same unhurried care he gave to mending a broken gate hinge. Never once laughing at her mistakes the way the wagon driver had laughed on her first ride into the territory. In turn, she began teaching him small fragments of her own language, words for snow and for patience, and one evening by the fire, with Etta curled asleep between them on the rug, a word that meant something closer to home than the English word itself managed to hold, and Caleb repeated it back to her twice, getting the tone slightly wrong both times, until Etta, half asleep, murmured a nearly perfect echo of it that made them both go still with something that wasn't quite laughter and wasn't quite grief either, but stood somewhere unnamed between the two. It was during those quiet fireside hours that Yeonhee began noticing the small collection of objects Caleb kept on a shelf near his bed, glimpsed only once when Ruth sent her to fetch a blanket, a woman's hair comb, a child's knitted bootie too small to have ever been worn twice, a Bible with a pressed flower still fitted between its pages like a bookmark someone had never returned to remove. She did not ask about them. She had learned enough of Caleb Whitmore's silences by then to recognize which ones were doors and which were walls, and she filed the shelf away instead as a question to hold rather than a question to force, the way she had once learned to hold her own grief on the long ocean crossing, patient, unresolved, and entirely her own, to carry until the day it wasn't. On a gray afternoon in mid-December, tasked with sorting through the last of her husband's few belongings that Caleb had carted over from the abandoned cabin and stored in the barn loft, rather than let sit exposed to weather, Yeon-hee found a small bundle of letters tied with twine, written in her own language in a hand she recognized instantly as her mother's, sent from Korea across an ocean to a man her mother had never met and would never meet, thanking him formally for the honor of his proposal and entrusting her only daughter to his keeping. She sat cross-legged on the cold loft floor for a long time, with those letters in her lap, reading her mother's careful, hopeful sentences about a future that had already ended 3 weeks before it began, and found herself crying in a way she had not allowed herself since the train platform, not for the loss of a husband she had never truly known, but for the strange, unbearable weight of having been promised to someone and then never given the chance to find out who he actually was, whether he would have been kind, whether she would have loved him, whether any of the versions of her future she had rehearsed on the ship would have come true in even the smallest particular. She found at the bottom of the bundle the photograph of herself that Caleb had described finding in the Bible on the shelf, worn soft at one corner as though a thumb had traced it often in the weeks before his death. And something in that small evidence of attention undid her more completely than the letters had. She had come to Iron Creek believing herself a wife in name only, a legal arrangement completed on paper and nothing more, and instead found herself grieving a man who had, it seemed, spent his last lonely weeks in a foreign country, looking at her face and perhaps, in whatever private language grief and hope share, beginning to fall toward loving her before the winter took him. She did not tell Caleb what she had found that day, though he noticed when she came down from the loft with red eyes and cold hands, and said nothing about it beyond quietly handing her a cup of coffee and finding an extra chore to occupy Etta, elsewhere in the house for the evening, a small unspoken kindness that left Yeon-hee wondering, not for the first time, exactly how many of her own unspoken griefs this careful, guarded man had already learned to read without being told, and how much longer she could go on carrying secrets in a house built, she was beginning to suspect, almost entirely out of other people's unspoken ones. What Yeon-hee did not yet know, though the reader standing close enough to Caleb Whitmore's silences might already have guessed it, was that he had ridden past the enclave 3 separate times in the 2 weeks before he finally found the chimney smoke gone cold, each time telling himself the same practical lie, that a new immigrant with no English and no experience of Wyoming winters was managing well enough, that a man ought to be given the dignity of struggling through his first season without a neighbor hovering, that Caleb himself had buried enough people that year without inviting more grief into his life by getting attached to a stranger's fate before it was any business of his. He had been wrong on every count, and he knew it with the particular clarity of a man replaying a decision in his mind so many times that the replaying had become its own private punishment, sharper by December than it had been the week he'd actually found Byung-ho collapsed against the cold hearth, dead of exposure and fever gone untreated, alone in a country where he'd had no one yet to call for help. Ruth, who had kept house for Caleb since his sister's death, and had therefore witnessed the whole slow architecture of his guardedness get built brick by brick, told Yeon-hee none of this directly, but let slip enough over shared kitchen work that Caleb blamed himself something fierce for not riding out sooner, that he'd said as much only once, drunk on grief rather than whiskey the night after the burial, and never spoke of it again, that Yeon-hee began piecing together, without full confirmation, why a man could dig a grave with such practiced terrible efficiency, and then spend every week afterward trying, in small, silent ways, to make up for a death he hadn't caused, but couldn't stop believing he might have prevented. It was in this frame of mind, still unspoken between them, that Caleb took Yeon-hee out to the north pasture one cold, clear morning and taught her, patiently and without a trace of the condescension she'd braced for, how to load and fire the old rifle he kept by the door, explaining in plain, careful sentences that a woman alone on a homestead with disputed water rights and a neighbor like Silas Draper circling ought to know how to protect herself, regardless of whether she ever chose to stay past spring. Yeon-hee understood, watching him demonstrate the mechanism with hands that had clearly done this teaching before, for Etta most likely, that this lesson was not really about a rifle at all, but about a man determined never again to stand helpless 3 weeks too late outside a door. He should have checked sooner, and she found herself, for the first time since arriving in Iron Creek, wanting badly to tell him that whatever guilt he was carrying did not belong to him, even though she did not yet have the words in either language to say it. That evening, with Etta long asleep and Ruth retired to her own small room off the kitchen, Caleb and Yunhee sat up later than usual by the fire, an easy, quiet groan between them over the preceding weeks that no longer required filling with conversation, until Caleb, staring into the coals with the particular stillness Yunhee had learned meant something was working itself loose in him, finally said her husband's name aloud, unprompted, for the first time since the day at the grave. He said that he'd been meaning to tell her something about those last weeks, before he found Byung-ho, that it sat wrong with him, the not telling, the way a stone sits wrong in a boot even after you've stopped noticing the ache of it most of the day. Yunhee turned toward him, her whole attention gathered, and for one long moment it seemed he would finally say the rest of it, the 3 separate rides past the smokeless chimney, the practical lies he'd told himself, the particular shape of the guilt Ruth had only half described to her. His jaw worked, his hands, usually so steady, went still on his knees in the specific way of a man bracing to speak a truth he had rehearsed alone many times, and never once said aloud to another living person. But then Etta's voice called out, thin and frightened, from the next room, some small nightmare pulling her from sleep, and Caleb was on his feet and through the doorway, before Yunhee could say a single word to hold him there, the moment gone as quickly as it had opened, folded back into the same silence it had briefly threatened to break. Yunhee sat alone by the dying fire afterward, turning over what little he had said, and found herself uncertain whether she was more troubled by what he had almost confessed, or by how badly, in that single unfinished moment, she had wanted him to. She did not yet have a name for the feeling settling into her chest in place of the numb grief she'd carried off the train 2 months before, only a growing, uneasy certainty that whatever truth Caleb Whitmore was carrying about her husband's death, she would rather hear it from his own mouth, in his own time, than piece it together secondhand from a housekeeper's careful silences, and that the waiting, however patient she tried to make it, was beginning to cost her something she hadn't expected to have left to spend. Late February brought a false thaw, 3 days of unseasonable warmth that softened the frozen ground enough for Caleb to declare it finally safe to move Yunhee's small inherited herd, 4 cows and a young bull, all that remained of Byung-ho's modest ambitions for the claim, from the sheltered north pasture back toward her own land, a practical step toward the spring planting Yunhee had quietly decided, without fully admitting it to herself yet, that she intended to see through rather than sell out from under. They discovered the herd gone on the 4th morning, the pasture gate not broken but deliberately opened, hoofprints leading in an unmistakable line toward the ridge above the creek where the ground fell away steep and rocky toward the water below, and it took Caleb only the length of that grim, silent ride to the ridge's edge to confirm what both of them already suspected before they arrived. 3 of the 4 cows lay broken at the base of the ravine, driven over in the dark by riders who had known exactly which direction would do the most damage with the least effort, and the 4th stood trembling and lamed on a narrow outcrop halfway down, unreachable without rope and daylight and considerable risk to whoever attempted it. Caleb dismounted without a word and studied the churned ground at the ridge's edge for a long, grim minute reading sign the way Yunhee had learned he read most things, quietly and thoroughly, before he said, flat and certain, that this hadn't been wolves or a spooked herd finding its own way to disaster, that whoever had done this had known the property line, known the pasture gate, and known precisely how to make an accident look almost convincing to anyone who didn't bother looking closely. Yunhee stood at the ridge's edge, staring down at what remained of her dead husband's small, hard-won herd, feeling something colder settle into her than the February wind alone could account for, a recognition that the town's cruelty she'd braced for on the train platform had apparently escalated, in the span of 1 warm week, into something with teeth. She asked Caleb, her English steadier now than it had been 2 months prior, though the question still came out clipped and careful, whether he believed this was Silas Draper's doing, and Caleb's silence in answer told her everything his words hadn't yet confirmed, a silence she was learning to read as clearly now as any spoken sentence he'd ever offered her. They rode back to the homestead in a silence heavier than the one that had carried them out to the ridge, and it was only once they'd reached the yard, once Caleb had seen to the surviving lamed cow with a care that told Yunhee plainly how little of his composure was actually intact beneath the surface calm, that he finally spoke his intentions aloud. He said he intended to ride into town the following morning and lay the matter directly at Silas Draper's feet, in front of whatever crowd happened to be gathered at the saloon or the mercantile, rather than pursue it quietly through the sheriff, whom Caleb trusted about as far as he trusted Draper himself, to enforce a fair outcome for a foreign widow's cattle. Ruth, overhearing from the kitchen doorway, cautioned him plainly that a public accusation without proof would only give the town more to gossip about at Yunhe's expense, that Draper had money and standing enough to make any confrontation cost Caleb more than it cost him, and that a careful man played this kind of hand quiet rather than loud. Caleb listened to all of it, jaw tight, hands still faintly trembling with an anger Yunhe had not yet seen him allow himself to show so plainly, and said only that he had spent 2 years now being careful and quiet about every grief this territory had handed him, his sister's death, Byung-ho's, and he was done being careful about a man willing to drive 4 defenseless animals off a cliff in the dark to frighten a widow into selling land she had every legal right to keep. Yunhe, watching him pace the small kitchen with the caged energy of a man deciding something irreversible, found herself frightened in a new way she hadn't anticipated, not for herself, not even entirely for the surviving cow shivering in the barn, but for Caleb, who seemed, in that moment, entirely prepared to walk into a room full of a town that already despised her and declare, publicly and permanently, exactly whose side he had chosen. She asked him quietly whether he understood what such a declaration would cost him in a town this small, whether he was prepared to be the man who'd chosen the foreign widow over every neighbor he'd have to keep doing business with for the rest of his life in Iron Creek. And Caleb stopped his pacing, looked at her directly for a long, unreadable moment, and said only that he'd already made worse choices for less reason, before he walked out to check the horses one final time before dark, leaving Yunhe alone with a question she suspected he had deliberately left unanswered.
Wait. Caleb rode into Iron Creek the next morning with Yunhe beside him, against Ruth's continued objections, because he said plainly he wasn't going to fight this particular battle by leaving her home to wonder about the outcome, and found, as county gossip so reliably arranged things, that Silas Draper himself was in town that day, holding court on the porch of the land office with 2 of his hired men flanking him like an audience he'd assembled on purpose. Caleb didn't dismount so much as arrive already speaking, laying out the ridge, the cattle, the deliberate hoof prints, in the same flat, unhurried voice he used for everything, while half the street gathered at a respectful distance to watch. The way a town always gathers for the promise of a fight, it can safely observe from its own porch. Draper, unbothered, denied any knowledge of the matter with the practiced ease of a man who had denied worse things before, and suggested with a glance toward Yunhe that made her skin go cold that perhaps the widow ought to consider how much simpler her situation would become if she simply sold the creek frontage to someone with the resources to actually work it properly, rather than clinging to a claim she couldn't defend, and a neighbor who couldn't be bothered to defend it for her either. It was that last phrase, couldn't be bothered, that seemed to finally strip whatever restraint Caleb had been holding onto since the ridge, and he crossed the last few yards of street in a way that made both of Draper's men shift their weight toward their holsters before Caleb ever raised his voice, and said, loud enough now for the whole gathered street to hear plainly, that the widow standing behind him was under his protection, land and person both, that anyone with business regarding her creek, her cattle, or her good name from this day forward could bring it to him directly, and that he'd take considerably less patience with the next accident than he'd taken with this one. The word protection landed in the street with a weight Yunhe felt more than understood in that first moment. A public claim more binding than anything spoken in a church or a courthouse. And she saw Louisa Thorne watching from the boardwalk with her mouth already open to begin some new cruelty, go abruptly, uncharacteristically silent instead, recalculating, as the whole street seemed to be recalculating, exactly what kind of man Caleb Whitmore had just declared himself willing to become for a woman none of them had thought worth defending 3 months prior. They rode home mostly in silence again, though it carried a different weight now than the grim quiet of the ridge, something charged and unresolved hanging between them that neither seemed quite ready to name aloud, until Caleb finally spoke once the homestead came into view, his voice rougher than usual, admitting that he hadn't fully thought through what he'd just said in the street, only that it had needed saying, and that a declaration like that, made in front of half the county, probably deserved to be made proper, rather than left dangling as a threat against Silas Draper, with nothing behind it but his own temper. He said, carefully, not quite looking at her as he said it, that the surest way to put the creek frontage and the whole disputed claim beyond Draper's reach permanently was for the land to belong to a marriage rather than a lone widow's inheritance. That he wasn't a man who'd ever expected to say such a thing to anyone again after his sister's death taught him how much loving people cost, but that he was saying it now, plainly, because he'd rather protect Yeon-hee as a husband with legal standing than as a neighbor whose claim to defend her could be argued away by any lawyer Draper cared to hire. Yeon-hee sat very still on the wagon seat beside him, her heart moving in a way that had nothing to do with the cold February air, torn between the sudden, dizzying want that rose in her at the plainness of his offer, and a fear equally sharp that she could not yet name to herself, let alone to him. Whether she was being asked because he had truly come to feel something for her, or only because it was, as he had framed it, the surest practical shield against Draper's greed, and whether a woman already made a widow once by a marriage of paper and promise had any right to hope for something warmer the second time around. She did not answer him that evening, and Caleb, to his credit, did not press her for one, only said that the offer would keep as long as she needed it to, that he wasn't a man in any particular hurry now that the words were finally spoken aloud. And Yeon-hee lay awake long after the house had gone quiet, turning the question over and over, wondering whether the trembling in her chest was fear of losing something she hadn't yet let herself want, or fear of the exact opposite, of getting it and discovering it wasn't safe to keep after all. It was Ruth, in the end, who forced the conversation neither Caleb nor Yeon-hee seemed able to start on their own, telling Caleb plainly over breakfast one morning in early March that a man couldn't build a second marriage on the same unspoken guilt that had nearly buried him after the first loss, that Yeon-hee deserved the whole truth about Byung-ho's death before she agreed to spend the rest of her life beside the man who'd found him, and that Caleb owed her that honesty regardless of how much it cost him to give it. He found Yeon-hee that afternoon, mending fence along the very pasture line where he'd first taught her to fire the rifle, and told her, without preamble this time, without Etta's cry from the next room to interrupt him, the whole of it. How many times he'd turn back toward town instead of checking on a struggling stranger, the excuses he'd dressed up as respect for a new immigrant's dignity and privacy, and the particular arithmetic of guilt that had settled into him the day the shovel finally left his hands, convinced he'd essentially let a man die of his own caution and called it neighborly restraint. He said he understood if the knowledge changed anything, if she could no longer stand the sight of the man who might have saved her husband and hadn't. And he said it steadily, without asking for comfort, the way a man confesses a debt he expects to have to pay in full. Yeon-hee listened to the entire confession without interrupting, watching his face work through emotions he usually kept locked well behind his eyes. And when he finally finished, she set down the fence wire in her hands and told him, in English grown steady and sure over 5 months of practice, that she did not blame him, that she had read her mother's letters and her husband's worn photograph and understood, more clearly than he seemed to, that grief invents guilt to give itself something to hold on to, that Byung-ho's death had been a country too harsh and a season too cold and a man too new to know how to survive either one, not a failure of any single neighbor's watchfulness. She told him that she had spent 3 months now watching him dig himself back out of that same guilt, one small kindness at a time, one lesson, one confrontation with Draper, one quiet cup of coffee left, wordlessly at her elbow, and that whatever debt he believed he owed her dead husband, he had paid it 100 times over already in how carefully he had treated his widow. Caleb, who had not cried at either grave he dug with his own hands, cried then, briefly and without apology, and Yeon-hee reached across the space between them and took his hand the way she had once traced a stranger's carved name on a wooden cross, deliberate, unhurried, and entirely her own choice this time. They married 3 weeks later, not in the church where Louisa Thorne still sat in her accustomed front pew, but at the kitchen table of Caleb's own house with Ruth and Etta as the only witnesses and a traveling circuit preacher passing through who agreed to perform the ceremony without asking either of them to explain the small, strange history behind it. Yeon-hee wore no wedding gown, only her best dark dress with the pale hanbok ribbon pinned deliberately visible at her collar, this time rather than hidden, a choice Caleb noticed and said nothing about beyond a look that told her he understood exactly what she meant by it. That she was not erasing the woman who had crossed an ocean for a different man's photograph, only allowing that woman to become, in addition, someone new. The vows were plain and short, the preacher clearly eager to be back on the road before the afternoon's weather turned, and Etta, solemn as ever through most of the brief ceremony, broke into unrestrained, delighted laughter at the very end, when Caleb, hands shaking slightly as he slid a simple iron band he'd shaped himself over a forge fire onto Yeonhee's finger, fumbled the ring twice before it finally settled, and Yeonhee found herself laughing too, a sound she realized, with some surprise, she had not made freely since long before the train platform in October. Ruth cried without any attempt to hide it, and even the preacher, who had likely performed 100 hurried frontier weddings in his circuit, paused a moment longer than strictly necessary before he pronounced them married, as though something about the particular tenderness in the room had caught him off guard as well. That evening, after the preacher had gone and Etta had finally been coaxed to bed, still wearing her good ribbon from the small celebration, Caleb and Yeonhee sat together on the porch step in the cold, clear March night. And Yeonhee allowed herself, for the first time since the wagon ride to a stranger's grave 5 months before, to feel something that resembled uncomplicated happiness. It did not last past the following silence, in which Caleb, staring out at the dark line of the ridge where her husband's cattle had died, admitted quietly that he doubted a wedding band alone would be enough to make Silas Draper abandon a piece of creek frontage he'd wanted for years, that a legal marriage closed one door against Draper's claims but likely opened another kind of danger entirely, one neither of them could yet predict the shape of. And Yeonhee, newly a wife for the second time in her life, found herself wondering just how much peace this particular happiness would be allowed to keep before the territory demanded its cost. Caleb's fear proved well-founded by the height of summer, when a dry spell settled hard over Iron Creek through July, turning the hard-won wheat Yeonhee had planted along the creek frontage, Draper's coveted water rights finally put to use exactly as he'd never wanted them to be, into a tinder-dry expanse that any careless spark could have ruined, and any deliberate one could ruin faster still. The fire came on a moonless night in early August, and it was Etta, restless with the heat and unable to sleep, who first smelled the smoke through her open window and screamed loud enough to wake the whole house before the flames had traveled more than 100 yards from where they'd been set, deliberately, along the fence line closest to Draper's own boundary, a detail that would matter considerably once the sheriff finally investigated weeks later. Caleb was out the door and shouting orders before Yeonhee had fully understood what was happening, sending Ruth to gather Etta and the wagon team toward the creek's safety, while he and Yeonhee, along with 2 ranch hands roused from the bunkhouse, worked a desperate line with wet sacks and shovels against a wind that seemed determined to carry the fire straight toward the house itself. Yeonhee fought that fire with a ferocity that surprised even herself, thinking of nothing beyond the next patch of flame needing beating down, the next bucket needing filling from the creek, until her hands blistered and her lungs burned with smoke, and the whole world had narrowed to orange light and roaring heat, and Caleb's voice somewhere ahead of her in the dark, steady even in crisis, calling directions that kept the line of defenders coordinated rather than scattered into panic. At the worst of it, with the fire nearly to the edge of the young orchard Caleb had planted the previous spring as a wedding gift, neither of them had spoken about directly. A burning fence post cracked and fell directly into Yeonhee's path, close enough that she felt the heat scorch her sleeve, and it was Caleb who reached her in that same instant, hauling her backward bodily out of the falling debris path, with an urgency that told her plainly, more than any words yet spoken between them, exactly how much he stood to lose that night beyond mere acreage. They held the line through the worst hours of the night, the wind finally shifting toward the creek sometime past 3 a.m. and taking the fire's momentum with it. And by the time gray dawn light finally showed the full scope of the damage, half the west fence line and a third of the wheat crop lay blackened. But the house, the barn, and the young orchard had all survived, singed at the edges but standing. Yeonhee sat exhausted in the ash-smelling dawn with her back against the barn wall, hands wrapped where the blisters had finally been tended, and watched Caleb walk the fire line slowly in the new light, crouching every so often to examine something in the burned grass with the same careful attention he'd once given the hoofprints at the ridge above the dead cattle. He came back to where she sat, holding a small, charred fragment of glass in his palm, the unmistakable broken bottom of a whiskey bottle of a particular brand, sold only at one establishment in the entire county, and said, quiet and grim, that fire didn't usually leave behind evidence quite this convenient, unless the men setting it had grown careless with confidence, certain no one would survive the night to go looking. Etta, brought back from the creek's safety by Ruth once the danger had passed, ran across the scorched yard and threw herself against Caleb's legs with the fierce, wordless relief of a child, confirming that the people she loved were still standing where she'd left them. And Caleb lifted her without hesitation, holding her against his smoke-stained shirt while he looked over her head toward Yunhee with an expression that held equal parts exhaustion, fury, and something that had grown, somewhere in the middle of that terrible night, into unmistakable tenderness. He said, low enough that only Yunhee could hear it clearly, that the moment he'd washed the smoke off his hands, he meant to carry that broken glass straight to the sheriff's office himself, that a piece of evidence this careless might finally be enough to force the county's hand against Draper where accusations alone had failed all spring. And Yunhee, watching him hold his niece with one arm and close his blistered free hand slowly into a fist at his side, understood that the fight for this land, and for whatever peace they'd built together on top of two men's graves, was not yet finished, only entering, at last, its final and most decisive hour.
Justice, when it finally arrived the autumn, came slower and quieter than either of them had expected. No dramatic arrest, no public confession. Only a county sheriff finally willing to act once the broken bottle and two other pieces of careless evidence made the case impossible to ignore any longer. And a quiet arrangement in which Silas Draper sold his own ranch at a considerable loss and left the territory before the first snow rather than face trial for the fire and whatever else. The investigation might eventually have uncovered about the 3 weeks nobody had checked on a lonely immigrant's chimney. Smoke the previous autumn. Iron Creek's Harvest Festival that October fell almost exactly 1 year after Yeonhee's arrival on the station platform, and the town gathered at the Grange Hall for it with the particular determined cheerfulness of a community eager to put a difficult year behind it. And Yeonhee walked into that same hall on Caleb's arm, wearing this time a dress of her own, choosing rather than a borrowed mourning dress. The pale hanbok ribbon worked openly now, into her braid rather than hidden at her collar, and found, to her quiet astonishment, that half the room turned to greet her by name rather than turning away. Louisa Thorne approached her near the cider table with visible discomfort, offered something that might have generously been called an apology if examined loosely enough, and asked, with what passed in her for humility, whether the wheat Yeonhee had managed to save from the fire and harvest, despite everything, might be the very bread served that evening. And Yeonhee, gracious in a way she had not owed the woman but chose to extend anyway, said simply that it was, and that there had been enough this year to share. Otis Dunlap's wife complimented the preserves Yeonhee had put up from the orchard Caleb had planted as a wedding gift, an orchard that had, against all early fear, survived the summer fire entirely intact along its eastern rows. And Ruth, watching from across the hall with Etta's hand in hers, remarked to no one in particular that it was a strange, satisfying thing to watch a town discover a year too late exactly what kind of woman it had nearly driven away entirely. Later that same evening, once the festival crowd had thinned and Etta had fallen asleep against Ruth's shoulder near the stove, Caleb and Yeonhee walked home together under a clear October sky, past the fence line already mended, past the orchard heavy with its first real harvest, past the low mound near the property's northern edge where a plain wooden cross still stood. Tended now rather than abandoned, flowers planted around its base every spring since the wedding, without either of them ever needing to discuss why. Yeonhee stopped there a moment, as she still did most weeks, and told the grave quietly, in her own language, that the wheat had come in fine this year, that Etta was learning to braid hair the way her mother might have taught her, that she hoped, wherever grief eventually settled, once it was finally allowed to rest, that Byung-ho had found some version of the peace she had built for herself in the place he'd first meant only as a beginning, and had instead become, through no fault of his own, an ending she'd had to walk through alone before this new life could properly start. Caleb waited a respectful distance off, as he always did during these quiet visits, never once made jealous or impatient by a devotion he understood better than most men could have, his own gaze drifting instead toward the lit window of the house where Etta slept, toward the mended barn roof,
toward the whole hard-won shape of a life he had once believed himself unfit to build again, after his sister's grave taught him how quickly a family could be taken from a man. When Yeonhee finally rose and took his offered hand, she pressed her other palm briefly, gently, against the small, still secret swell beneath her coat that she had not yet found the words to tell him about, deciding in that moment under the wide Wyoming stars that tomorrow would be soon enough for one more beginning in a year that had already asked her to survive so many endings. If a stranger's grave could grow eventually into an entire thriving life neither of them had dared imagine on that cold October afternoon a year before, she thought, then perhaps every ending this hard country handed a person really did carry some quieter beginning folded inside it, waiting only for someone patient enough and brave enough to stay and dig it out. Tell us in the comments which moment broke your heart the most, and if this story of a grave, a stranger, and the home built beside it stayed with you. Subscribe for more tales of quiet love found in the hardest corners of the frontier.